I'm Lisa Ruble from Quilty Zest, and I'm here today with Sit and Sew Fabrics to walk you through the block making for the Autumn Triangles Quilt Kit. This is a great fall project made with all kinds of harvesty colors, reds, oranges, yellows, browns, and it uses 10 fat quarters for the scrappy part and then 2 solid colors for the blocks. Let's take a look at what's in the kit. So of course we've got our pattern right here with all the steps you need to put the quilt together. And then we've got the 10 fat quarters, brown. This includes the binding as well. And then some yellows, oranges. This just looks like fall, doesn't it? Such a great collection of harvesty colored prints. And then to go with the prints, we have these 2 solids, sand and natural, and they are the perfect background for the blocks to allow all of these prints to shine as you piece them together. So let's talk cutting for the fat quarters. So I'm going to fold mine in half so that this measures about 10.5 inches the long way. I'm going to start out by just giving myself a nice clean straight edge to work with. And from each fat quarter, we're going to cut 2 3 7/8 inch strips. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to find that 7/8 inch mark on the ruler because it's tiny, so just make sure you've got it. Then I'm gonna trim off the selvages from the strip and cut it into squares. We're gonna need a total of 9 3 7/8 inch squares. You see there's still a nice chunk of that fat quarter left that you can use for another fall project or to make a bigger quilt with more blocks. Okay, same thing on this one. So I've got 5 there, so I just need 4 more from this strip. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to set aside 3 of these squares and leave them whole. And for the other 6, I'm going to cut them in half. And you can see these are still paired from my square cutting, so I can leave them paired, align my ruler from point to point, and cut these in half. Great, so I'm going to do that as well with my second fat quarter, and then I'll have all of the prints I need to sew my first block. So to make a block, you're going to need 2 triangles and 1 square from one print, 2 triangles and 1 square from a second print, 2 of the sand squares, and then 2 larger triangles. These are 6 7/8 inch squares cut in half, and then 2 6.5 inch squares. And now let's talk about how to put all these pieces together. I'm going to move these guys out of the way. So the first thing we're going to do is make half square triangles. So I'm going to draw a line on the wrong side of both of these sand squares. Okay, and then I'm going to pair 1 with each of my print squares, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of these drawn lines. And for my sewing, I'm going to choose a neutral thread that will work with all of these prints, and I've got, this is the Madeira Katona, this is Ecru, color number 504. And you can see it blends really nicely with my background fabric, and so that will allow my thread to disappear into my fabric. So I've stitched on both sides of both of my drawn lines for these units, and now I'm going to cut on that drawn line, which will give me 2 half square triangle units. You can see I've got 1, 2 with this brown print, and then 1, 2 with this orange print. Okay, now I'm going to press these, and I'm going to press so that my seam allowance goes towards my darker fabric for each of these. And then we'll trim them up to the size that we need and start assembling our block. These blocks go together very quickly because they don't have a lot of pieces. And the other benefit is that, so you'll notice we made our half square triangles 2 at a time here. We're only going to use 1 in one block, so we'll have a second one to set aside that will be ready to use for our next block. So now I'm going to trim each of these, square them up to measure 3.5 inches. And so I'm going to use is this diagonal line on my ruler and line it up with the diagonal seam line and trim those edges. You can see I'm trimming just a tiny little bit off. And then when I turn it, in addition to aligning my diagonal line, I'm going to make sure that my 3.5 inch lines are lined up. And again, it's just the tiniest little bit coming off, but it will help your finished quilt block to be as square as possible. Okay, I'm going to set aside the brown prints for the moment, and we're going to work with the orange prints. So our block gets set up like this, and then the sand triangle will go right there, and this is 1/4 of our block. So the first thing we're going to do is to sew this triangle to this half square triangle unit. You want to make sure you're sewing it to the sand side, not to the print side. And what we're going to do is align. You'll see this seems like it's too large, and that's to account for our seam allowances. So we're going to line up the straight edges at the top and let this tip extend at the bottom. So I'm going to flip it over like this. Make sure my seam allowance, make sure that my raw edges are lined up at the top, and put a pin in to hold it. And now I'm just going to stitch down here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so that's what that looks like. I'm going to press it. And now we're going to add that second print triangle. And that's going to go down here. What we're going to do actually is trim off this little point here. Okay. And then this will go here. Now, same thing. We're going to align my straight edges over here and allow that tip to extend out. So I'm going to put that up and put a pin in again. And now I think it's easier to start sewing from this end rather than this loose point out here. So what I'm actually going to do is flip it over and stitch down this side. So here it is with my second triangle stitched on, and you can see the overlap here. There's about a 1/4 inch of overlap, and that's going to be my seam allowance for joining these two triangles together. So if for some reason you don't have that overlap, you may want to go back and pick the second triangle out and try again with a slightly smaller seam allowance. If your seam allowance tends to go a little wide, you will lose that. So you want to make sure you have that, because that allows us to have a point there on our block. So what I'm going to do now, actually what I'm going to do first, is trim off that little tip right there. Just get it out of the way. Okay, now I'm going to sew the piece triangle to the sand triangle. So I'm going to put them together, but I'm going to put my piece side on top, because then I can keep an eye on where my point is. And now these are bias cut edges, and so they're very stretchy and also very small at the ends. So you want to get pins as close to the end as you can. And then I'm going to put another one in the middle. And so what I'm going to do now is stitch down here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I want to make sure that my stitch line is right near this intersection of the stitch lines here. And that will give me a point on my sand square. Okay, I've got that stitched on. And I'm going to press this seam allowance towards my solid fabric because that just eliminates bulk here from where I've got several layers with the piecing. And you can see if I hold it up close, you can see I've got the point there of my sand triangle, so that worked out great. And this is 1/4 of my block. So we're going to put the ruler on it. We want it to be 6.5 inches square. So really what you'll just need to be doing is trimming off those little dog ears. There we go. So now we're going to do the same thing with our second color. Set this 1/2 square triangle aside for the next block, and this goes here. So I'm going to do the same thing. So this triangle to the 1/2 square triangle, and then add this one, and then sew those to our larger square to create my other pieced 1/4 block. So there is one of my finished 1/4 blocks, and here's a second one. So these are both 6.5 inches square, and we're going to lay them out with 6.5 inch square sand pieces. So I've got them set up so the pieced sections are in opposite corners. So I'm going to sew these two together and these two together and then join them to make the block. And here's my finished block. This is one of the sand blocks. I've also got a block made out of the natural, and you can see there's just a subtle contrast between these two that creates a really interesting secondary design here in amongst our little piece triangle corners. So you'll be making 15 blocks with the sand background and 15 blocks with the natural background. And you can mix and match which of the prints you put together in each of those blocks to create a really great scrappy look. And once you have all the blocks done, you're going to sew them into 6 rows of 5, and then sew those rows together and your quilt top is complete. Then you baste it, quilt it, and bind it using this dark brown fabric, and your quilt is ready to enjoy. So I hope you've enjoyed this video learning how to make the blocks for the Autumn Triangles quilt. If you don't have this kit yet, head over to sitansewfabrics.com, search up Autumn Triangles, and you can grab a kit and make your own version of this. We've also got plenty of other fabric, both by the yard and in kits for quilts. Some of them pre-cut where you don't have to do any of the cutting yourself, and some of them with yardage, like this one where you'll be doing the cutting. So head over to Sit and Sew Fabrics and grab all your favorite sewing supplies.